On the 6th of November 1860, Americans voted in the most divided election in their history. With the vote of the Democratic Party split between two candidates, the Republican Party's nominee, Abraham Lincoln, won election with only 40% of the vote. Lincoln was a political outsider who had failed to win election to the Senate in 1858. The southern states viewed him as a radical, and 6 weeks later, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union. Did the southern states overreact to Lincoln's election, and could the American Civil War have been prevented? This is the story of Abraham Lincoln and the struggle to end slavery in the United States. The man known to history as Abraham Lincoln was born on the 12th of February, 1809, at Sinking Spring Farm, a farm with a one-room log cabin near Hodgenville in the state of Kentucky in the United States. His father was Thomas Lincoln, a skilled carpenter and farmer who was illiterate. He was the descendant of a weaver's apprentice who had migrated from England to Massachusetts in 1637. Abraham's mother, Nancy Hanks, is a mysterious figure. She was possibly illegitimate and came from a family of modest Virginia farmers. Thomas and Nancy had married in 1806 in Washington County. The family then moved to Elizabethtown in Kentucky. They had 3 children. Abraham had an older sister named Sarah and a younger brother, Thomas Jr., although Thomas Jr. died in infancy. After Abraham's father lost his farm in a dispute over property titles, the Lincolns moved to Indiana in 1816, which became the 19th state of the Union that year. This was as a free state, meaning that the ownership of and trade in slaves was not permitted in the state. As the United States expanded westwards between the 1810s and 1850s, this question of whether or not newly admitted states should be free or slave-owning states became a politically contentious one. It would prove to be a critical factor in the descent into the American Civil War. As a member of the Separate Baptist Church, Abraham's father opposed slavery on religious and moral grounds. His son inherited his views, and Abraham later reflected that he could not remember a time when he was not opposed to the practice of slavery. Life in Indiana was hard for the Lincolns, who lived in a remote forest in Hurricane Township, Perry County. The hardships the family faced worsened after the death of Abraham's mother on the 5th of October 1818. Her death was owing to milk sickness, a form of poisoning caused by ingesting milk produced by a cow that has fed on white snake root. Recognizing that his family could not go on alone, Thomas Lincoln married Sarah, Sally, Bush Johnston in December 1819, a widow from Elizabethtown with 3 children of her own. From an early age, Abraham loved to read. This was despite the fact that by the age of 15, he had only been sporadically educated for a year or so, as his farm chores and remote location meant he could not attend school regularly. However, Lincoln's educational grounding was enough for him to be able to teach himself through reading whatever volumes he could find. He would always prefer more cerebral pursuits to the hard labor of farm work. This caused friction between Abraham and his father, and by his late teens, Lincoln was desperate to leave his isolated home. Thus, after helping his family move to the state of Illinois in 1830, he departed for the town of New Salem in July 1831, leaving his family for the final time. He would never see his father again. His sister had died in 1828. The issue of Abraham's difficult relationship with his father continues to interest historians to this day. Less than a year after moving to New Salem, 23-year-old Lincoln ran for election to the state legislature, a demonstration of his self-confidence at such a young age. Nevertheless, his lack of political connections or any government experience counted against him, and he failed to win election. Abraham spent the next 2 years in various forms of employment, including serving as a militia captain in the Black Hawk War with a local Native American tribe and working as the postmaster for New Salem. He continued to read avidly, taking a particular interest in poetry and grammar. 2 years later, he ran again for the Illinois state legislature and won this time round in August 1834. Although he was not a very active participant in his first term in the legislature, Lincoln made numerous political acquaintances at the Illinois capital, including his future rival, Stephen A. Douglas. During this time, Lincoln also trained to become a lawyer, and after moving to Springfield, Illinois in April 1837, he opened his own legal practice. That same year in Illinois, an act of violence occurred that highlighted the growing tensions that were simmering beneath the surface of the American nation. In November, a mob in the town of Alton murdered Elijah Lovejoy, the editor of an abolitionist newspaper which had campaigned relentlessly for an end to slavery. This brutal killing enraged public opinion in the northern free states and foreshadowed the national violence that would begin in 1861. As well as pursuing a career in law, Lincoln's involvement in Illinois politics continued to grow. He became the leader of the Whig Party in the legislature and played a role in managing the state's transition to the free banking era, a period between 1837 and 1863 when the U.S. had no central bank. Lincoln's legal career took a dramatic leap forward when he was offered a partnership with Stephen Logan, one of the most prominent lawyers in Illinois. Under Logan's tutelage, Lincoln grew into one of the foremost lawyers in the state and was able to earn a very comfortable living. Lincoln also became engaged to a young woman by the name of Mary Todd, the daughter of Robert Smith Todd, a wealthy Kentuckian merchant and slave owner. Although her family background should have been off-putting to the abolitionist Lincoln, he was quite enchanted by Mary's beauty and intelligence when they first met. They were married on the 4th of November 1842, and Mary gave birth to their first child, a boy, who they named Robert, on the 1st of August 1843. Abraham was an affectionate husband and father to 4 children, as after Robert came Eddie and Willie, who both died in childhood, and Thomas, or Tad, Lincoln, who died of heart failure at the age of 18. The loss of their children had long-lasting effects on both parents. Lincoln suffered from what was called melancholy at the time, what is now recognized as clinical depression. Mary was temporarily admitted in later life to an asylum by her only remaining child, Robert. After he married, Lincoln's legal career went from strength to strength. He entered a new partnership in which he was the senior member and began to appear frequently in cases before the Illinois Supreme Court. He also continued to involve himself in Whig politics, and in 1846 he won election to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing the 7th District of Illinois after winning by an unprecedented majority in the district. Thus, from the humblest of beginnings, Abraham had forged a successful political and legal career for himself. The Lincolns set off for Washington, D.C. on the 25th of October 1847. Lincoln was entering Congress in the midst of the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. The background to the Troubles was the establishment of the Republic of Texas back in 1836. This nation, which straddled the border of both the United States and Mexico, lasted just under 10 years before it was annexed by the U.S. Boundary disputes around the Rio Grande between the Mexicans and Americans swiftly led to war between the two nations. It was not an equal clash, and the U.S. military commenced an immensely successful campaign into Mexico that ended with the country ceding extensive territory running all the way west to California and Oregon. The peace agreement in 1848 and the inception of the California Gold Rush the very same year fueled westward migration in the late 1840s and into the 1850s. This, in turn, created fresh tensions over the issue of whether newly admitted states would be free states or slave-owning. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise had prohibited slavery in all territories west of the Mississippi and north of the 36° 30 parallel, but with the rapid westward expansion from 1848 onwards, the Missouri Compromise began to break down. Lincoln and the majority of the Whig Party perceived that Texas could be broken up into several states, a move which would swing the balance of power in the Congress in favor of slave-owning states. Thus, in his first actions upon arriving at Washington, D.C., while the war with Mexico was still underway, Lincoln spoke out against the war, decrying what he termed the warmongering of Democratic President James K. Polk in entering into a conflict which was sure to drive further westward expansion and lead to the creation of new states. Terms in the House of Representatives lasted only 2 years in the 19th century, and Lincoln had always stated that he only intended to serve one term. He was true to his word, and so, in 1849, he returned to Illinois. Incredibly, his 2 years as a House member between 1847 and 1849 was his only experience of national politics in Washington, D.C. prior to becoming president. All of his other experience was on the state political level in Illinois. Between 1849 and 1854, Lincoln dedicated himself totally to the legal profession, touring the 8 judicial circuits for 6 months of every year. However, in 1854, Lincoln was awoken from his political slumber by a law passed by Congress that would ignite the nation and fan the flames of the divisive slave issue. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was instituted that year after being promoted by Lincoln's long-term political rival, the Illinois Democrat Stephen Douglas. It proposed to allow settlers of any new U.S. territory to decide, through popular vote, whether or not slavery would be permitted in the state, a proposal which would effectively overturn the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and its provision that more northerly parts of the American West could not become slave-owning states. Upon hearing the details of the act, Lincoln announced to his fellow lawyers, "This nation cannot exist half slave and half free," a statement which reflected the guiding principle of Lincoln's future years. Provoked back into political life, Lincoln campaigned fiercely against the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Illinois. The debate that erupted over the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 reshaped the American party system. During it, the Democrats emerged as the staunch supporters of slavery and its extension westwards, although there were significant divisions within the party that would facilitate Lincoln's surprise election as president of the nation 6 years later. Even in 1854, these divisions were such that some former Democrats, along with the rump of the Whigs, were involved in the formation of the new Republican Party that year. The Republicans virtually replaced the Whigs overnight in the U.S. party system. Lincoln played an active role in the formation of this new anti-slavery party. He delivered a speech at the party's first Illinois convention on the 29th of May, 1856, where he so mesmerized his audience that, legend has it, all of the reporters forgot to write down what he actually said. That November, the Democrat, James Buchanan, was elected as president. However, the new Republican Party secured an impressive result, gaining 1.3 million votes, much to the alarm of Southern slave owners. These tensions over slavery began to reach a crescendo in 1857 with the stunning intervention of the Supreme Court in the famous Dred Scott versus Sandford case. This concerned a Missouri slave, Dred Scott, who had been taken by his owner to the free states of Illinois and Minnesota, and then returned to the slave state of Missouri, where his master died, following which Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had previously been a resident of the free states. The case reached the Supreme Court, where the head of the court, Chief Justice Roger Taney, declared that the case was void because, as a black man, Scott was not a citizen of the United States. Indeed, the court went further, declaring that all congressional laws excluding slavery from the Western territories were unconstitutional. While the court had sought to appease the southern states and temper further unrest in the country, their decision had the opposite effect. It inflamed public opinion in the northern states and accelerated the drift towards civil war. Lincoln was now fully reinvested in politics and set his sights on the upcoming 1858 elections. On the 16th of June 1858, the Illinois branch of the Republican Party nominated Lincoln to take on his great rival, the Democrat Stephen Douglas, in the race to become the new senator for Illinois. Lincoln's speech in acceptance of the nomination is one of his best known. It was here that he stated that "a house divided against itself cannot stand." To gain an equal footing with his more famous opponent, Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of public debates in 7 towns around the state. Douglas reluctantly accepted. Today, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are regarded as being amongst the most significant political debates in American history, with these two master orators dueling verbally with one another over 7 events. The debates attracted such large audiences that they had to be held outside, with audiences regularly in the tens of thousands. During these verbal feuds, Douglas accused Lincoln and his party of being radical abolitionists, while Lincoln posed awkward questions for Douglas, forcing him to break with his party over the issue of whether settlers in new states could choose to exclude slavery in line with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas's affirmation that they could was popular with the Illinois electorate and helped him to defeat Lincoln in the Senate race, yet it estranged him from his party, preventing him from ever becoming president.
Before we continue, we'd like to thank our sponsor, LingoPie, an excellent learning app that helps you become a lifelong learner, exploring new cultures and broadening your horizons through entertainment and education. When we research historical figures from Spain or Latin America, we often come across interviews, documentaries, and archival footage in Spanish. And for the longest time, we thought, well, watching enough Spanish content will eventually make it sink in. It didn't. That's where LingoPie comes in. LingoPie lets you learn Spanish and 12 other languages by watching real TV shows, films, and documentaries. But here's what makes it different. Every subtitle is interactive. You can click on any word for an instant translation. You can see both Spanish and English at the same time with dual subtitles. If someone speaks too quickly, you can slow the scene down without distorting the audio. And if there's a phrase you want to remember, it automatically saves as a flashcard for later practice. There are built-in quizzes and pronunciation tools so you can actually test yourself by saying the sentence aloud, and even short stories to strengthen listening skills. It turns passive watching into active learning. But what we appreciate most is that it prepares you for real conversations, the way people actually speak, idioms, expressions, and cultural references. We've been using it to improve our Spanish, and the difference is noticeable. When we next visit Spain, we won't just know how to ask someone's name, we'll understand the reply. If you've ever felt that traditional language learning is dry or overwhelming, this is a far more immersive and, frankly, more enjoyable way to do it. If you'd like to start learning Spanish or explore one of the other languages available, click the link in the description for a free 7-day trial and exclusive discount.
Despite ultimately losing the Senate race in November 1858, Lincoln gained substantial votes for the Republicans in what was ordinarily a firmly Democratic state. Moreover, he had acquired a national reputation for his eloquent opposition to the expansion of slavery. While Lincoln was stung by his defeat, he had no intention of retiring from politics. Rather, his eyes were now set on the presidential election of 1860, for which the increasingly popular Republican Party was without a leader. In late 1859 and early 1860, Lincoln made moves to expand his reputation in the old East Coast states, publishing a book of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which became a bestseller. Furthermore, in February 1860, Lincoln was invited to speak to a Republican Union in New York, where he gave an address that gained acclaim from major New York newspapers. Following this, Lincoln traveled to New England, speaking and gaining Republican allies far from his Illinois home. On the 16th of May 1860, Republican delegates met in Chicago for the Republican National Convention. There, they nominated Lincoln as their presidential nominee, narrowly edging out Senator William Seward of New York, who would become Lincoln's Secretary of State. It is noteworthy that Lincoln was selected because he was considered to be the more moderate candidate who could win over swing voters in some of the more contentious states. Lincoln was firmly against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. At the same time, he was against abolishing the practice where it already existed, arguing that a measure like this was sure to provoke civil war or the disintegration of the Union. Meanwhile, at the Democratic Convention, held in Charleston, South Carolina on the 23rd of April, there were severe divisions between Northern Democrats in favor of the more moderate Senator Douglas and Southern Democrats who wanted a more unequivocally pro-slavery candidate. The convention failed to come to a consensus on a candidate, and at a reconvened convention held in Baltimore, the party split. The Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, whilst the Southern Democrats backed John Breckinridge of Kentucky. Both men would be on the ballot paper. With the Democratic Party divided, their vote would be split, while a fourth candidate representing the Constitutional Union, John Bell, further fragmented the election landscape. Bell was running on a platform that preserving the Union should be the primary concern of the next president. It is a truism of the election held on the 6th of November 1860 that Abraham Lincoln could not have won it had it not been for the divisions within the Democrats. Between them, the three pro-slavery candidates, both radical and moderate, won over 60% of the vote. Lincoln, with 39.7% of the vote, became the 16th President of the United States. There had already been worrying signs about unrest during the election campaign should Lincoln win it and become president. Some politicians in the southern states had made statements about seceding from the Union if Lincoln won, but most observers had assumed this was merely a political ploy. However, just 4 days after the election, South Carolina authorized the creation of a state convention to consider the future relations between the state and the Union. Within a month, every state in the Deep South had followed suit. Lincoln believed the South to be bluffing in order to extract concessions from the North. As such, he failed to recognize the strength of secessionist sentiment in the cotton-growing states, who believed that their right to practice slavery was severely threatened by the new Republican president. Then, on the 20th of December 1860, South Carolina declared that the state would withdraw from the Union. In January 1861, South Carolina was joined by Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana. Texas followed in February. Senator Jefferson Davis became the president of the new Confederate States of America. Though secession occurred rapidly, it was by no means all owing to Lincoln's election. The South's attachment to slavery had caused a growing estrangement from the northern free states over many decades, as the southern economy remained agricultural, whilst the North industrialized and expanded its urban population. When this growing detachment reached its climax with the result of the 1860 election, an idea that had been discussed and debated for decades among Southern politicians was finally put into action. Lincoln's election was the catalyst for secession, not the cause. When Abraham Lincoln rose to deliver his inaugural address on the 4th of March 1861, the United States was in the midst of the worst crisis it had ever experienced. The president appealed to the nation's better nature, stating, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." With this, he urged reconciliation rather than conflict, and the preservation of the Union. Lincoln entered the White House clinging to this one belief above all others, that the Union must be saved at all costs. the most pressing matter for the president was that of Fort Sumter in South Carolina, where a Union army under Major Robert Anderson had garrisoned the fort. This was located in the middle of Charleston Harbor, surrounded on three sides by Confederate batteries. Lincoln did not want to withdraw the army to maintain Union prestige. However, he could not send reinforcements into the hostile harbor either. On the other side, the new Confederate government viewed Anderson's garrison as a foreign army occupying a fort within their new nation. Thus, on the 12th of April 1861, the Confederate batteries began a bombardment of Fort Sumter. After 34 hours, Anderson's garrison was forced to surrender. The American Civil War had begun. The fall of Fort Sumter galvanized public sentiment in the northern states against what northern newspapers depicted as a southern rebellion, not the creation of a new country. On the 15th of April, President Lincoln called for the states to supply a militia of 75,000 men. This was received with a wave of approval across the North, as nationalist feeling caused a surge of support for war with the Confederacy. However, this call for troops disgruntled the states of the Upper South, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, who finally decided to secede from the Union on the 17th of April. The Confederacy then moved its capital to Richmond, Virginia. On the following day, Lincoln offered the command of the Union armies to the Virginia colonel, Robert E. Lee, who declined, stating that he could not draw his sword against his native state. Instead, he would become the foremost Confederate commander. Growing in confidence in his position, Lincoln now took further steps to prepare the Union for war, proclaiming a blockade of Confederate ports on the 19th of April and expanding the Union armies and navy. In his 4th of July address to Congress, Lincoln set out his view of the conflict. The Confederacy was not a separate country. Its leaders were rebels who needed to be defeated and brought back under Washington's control. Meanwhile, the Northern clamor for a major strike to try to seize the new Confederate capital of Richmond in Virginia, which was extremely close to Washington, D.C., became irresistible. Lincoln yielded to it, authorizing a force of 28,000 to leave Washington on the 16th of July and march into Virginia, where the First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as it is known in the South, saw the Union force routed from the field. There would be no swift victory over the Confederates. A prolonged conflict beckoned. The defeat was a devastating blow to Union morale. Lincoln immediately ordered General George McClellan, a graduate of the West Point Military Academy, to come to Washington and take command of the newly created Army of the Potomac, hoping to instill organization and discipline into the young volunteers of the Union Army. McClellan transformed the inexperienced band of eager Northern recruits into a disciplined fighting force, rigorously training his troops and keeping a watchful eye over their progress and well-being. But problems over his leadership would nevertheless emerge before long. While McClellan and other Union generals began to establish a more professional army, Lincoln's attentions were on